Welcome to Behavioral Grooves. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We are building a community of people who want to understand how to positively apply behavioral science to their work and life. We achieve this by having fun and engaging conversations with a wide variety of people. Today, we are excited to have Francesca Gino with us.
Francesca is a professor and researcher at Harvard Business School. She describes herself as a curious behavioral scientist, passionate about teaching and helping leaders make wiser decisions that can improve their lives and those of the people around them. She's the author of dozens of peer-reviewed articles on decision-making, and her books include Sidetracked from 2013 and more recently, Rebel Talent, a book that highlights why the most successful people break the rules and how rebellion brings joy and meaning into our lives. Francesca isn't the kind of person who just doles out good advice. She often tests it out first on herself, her husband, her children, her students, and colleagues, and even the business leaders she consults with.
She's a tester.
She's a rebel thinker and a doer, and her drive to discover answers to the why we do what we do question is without limits.
We talked about what it is like to be a rebel, but we mostly talked about curiosity and how important that trait is to have for individuals and how organizations can cultivate it. In our grooving session at the end, we groove on curiosity, some historical components of it, how yes and can be used to create psychological safety, and how it can be primed.
Primed?
Primed!
We love that. At least I do. We also groove a bit on creativity and how parameters can actually increase our creativity in some instances. Tim also sings in this episode.
Oh, God.
He was goaded on by Francesca, and so at the end of the interview, he does an a cappella.
Okay. We are building behavioral grooves to be a community of people who are interested in positively applying behavioral science to their work and lives. And we like to think we're good, but here is a listener review from April Seifert, who says, quote, "The Behavioral Grooves podcast is one of those rare gems that combines really engaging, approachable, dare I say, human being hosts with research-backed informative topics. If you are at all interested in the field of psychology, this is a great destination for you. Their guests are wide-ranging, and you'll walk away with a better understanding of psychology than you'd ever get in any Psych 100 college course."
Yeah.
Thanks, April.
Thank you, April. Yeah, we're kind of professors, huh?
I wish.
I know, wouldn't that be great? We would be grateful if you could help expand our community. And you could do that by recommending this or another Behavioral Groups episode to a friend, or leaving a review on your favorite pod service, just like April did.
Hey, also, if you're interested in connecting with Kurt or me, we can be reached on Twitter or LinkedIn, and our handles will be shown in the show notes. So we'd love to start a conversation with you.
Please engage your curiosity as you listen to our conversation with Francesca Gino.
Welcome, Francesca Gino, to the Behavioral Grooves podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We are super excited to have you on as a guest. We typically start with a speed round. And so let's get going. You want to go?
Yes. Monet or Michelangelo?
Michelangelo.
Of course. Of course.
Pizza or pasta?
Pizza.
Ah, okay. Which would be better? A company with 100% rebels, 50% rebels, or 0% rebels?
I would go for the 100% rebels.
Oh, we're going to have to talk about that later.
Okay.
Last speed round question. Can you prime curiosity? Can you get people primed to be more curious?
Yes, we can. And I have some good evidence for that.
Well, then let's talk about that.
Let's go into that, because that's one of our key things that we wanted to talk to you about. So how do you prime for curiosity, and what's some of the research point to?
Well, one of the things that we tend to forget is that we were born curious. In fact, for anyone who has small children or just good images of who we were as children, it's a lot, if not all, about asking questions and really approaching the world with that sense of wonder. And if you look at the data, what's interesting is that curiosity peaks at the age of 4 and 5, and then it declines steadily from there. I have 3 small children. I can tell you that it's constant exploration in our house. In fact, just the other day, my son was asking me, why is that the sky is blue? Why is it that we need to wear clothes when we leave the house? Why is it that we need to pay for things? All sorts of good questions that comes from the eyes of a little person, just not knowing much about the world. Now, what's interesting is that despite the fact that we're born curious, once we're put into the world, and it starts with schools, but then with organizations, with our jobs, somehow that curiosity gets shut down. And in fact, at some point, it was really interesting in seeing how that happens. And I collected some data on a sample of people. So imagine 300 people starting off a new job across industries, across type of jobs. And generally, when you measure the level of curiosity at the start, it's pretty high, some variations, but pretty high. And when you go back to the same people 6 to 8 months later, at least in the data I collected, the curiosity had dropped by at least 20% across the board.
Wow.
That's disappointing, but it's also a missed opportunity for ourselves because we would get more joy out of the work that we do when we stay curious, but also for the organizations where these people work. And so I've been thinking a lot about what it is that we can do to keep our curiosity alive, but also what it is that organizations can do to remind people to be curious. So in a recent study, we tried that at a large Canadian bank. And what we decided to do for a few weeks, in fact, it was once for a few weeks, is send people a text or an email, in which we reminded them to ask questions throughout their day at work, to ask why, what if, and it's just trying to get people out of this mode of just executing, do your job, checking off items from your to-do list, and being a little bit more thoughtful about the opportunity that we have to explore. And so that was a way for us to prime people to think more curiously about the world that they're in.
So it just took a text that says, remember to ask more questions to really do that.
Yeah.
Wow.
And how did you measure the effect?
So what we were looking in this particular study, what we were looking at was to see how people develop more relationships at work. So their networks become wider and broader and more diverse. And so that's what we captured. In one case, in one study, we capture it by asking questions about people's networks. So asking them to reflect back to the type of relationship that they nurture or created at work. And in another case, the case of the bank, they actually gave us email data. So we could look at whether people start writing more emails to people even outside of their group, but they go to people in other departments, in other functions, in other units. And so we were able to tell with more objective measures, if you will, that curiosity is really important in allowing us to really diversify our networks and get to collaborate with others more effectively.
That is fabulous. That is just fabulous. So you mentioned there were two things. So reminding employees is one really good thing and an effective way. What was the second way?
So it's triggering this question. Get them started to ask questions like why question or what if or how could it be type questions. Because again, we are sort of trying to fight that tendency to just take things for granted. One of my favorite exercises this day, whenever I visit the organization, is to try really to pay attention to processes, systems, or ways of working that just seem strange to a person who doesn't work there.
Okay.
And then usually I go to the people who work there and say, well, I've noticed that this process seems to be in place. Can you tell me why? How did that come about? And nobody has good answers. The only answer usually is because we've been doing this for many years the same way. It's just not a good answer. And so I think that we tend to take a lot of processes, traditions inside the organization for granted. And curiosity allows us to push back on that tendency and really open our eyes to something different.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned at the very beginning that 4 or 5-year-old curiosity and asking about the color of the sky and why do we wear clothes going out. And sometimes it's really hard when you have your children ask you those questions to go, why? I mean, why do, summertime, why do I have to my daughter is 9 now and she needs to put on her swimsuit top. And she's like, why? And I was like, cause. And she goes, well, my brother doesn't. And I'm like, well, yeah. But it gets to be, so you have to start really thinking through the responses. And I think that's what you're saying in these organizations. If they're not asking the questions, they're not thinking through why of all that component. So
yeah, and you miss out on all this amazing world of possibilities that we could get to if we just started thinking differently about the problem. One of the examples that really inspired the book Rebel Talent, at least for me, was discovering the story of now a rather famous Italian chef. His name is Massimo Bottura, and he's the chef and owner of a 3 Michelin star restaurant that in 2016 became the best restaurant in the world. And then again in 2018, they were back at the top of the list. And what is interesting and fascinating about his story is that he went into a context, traditional Italian dishes, and started asking questions with curiosity. And it's a powerful story because if you know anything about Italians, 2 things are true. First, there are all sorts of rules when it comes to cooking. In the way you pair a certain type of pasta to a certain type of sauce. My husband, who's American, still doesn't understand why is it that you can't put cheese on a pasta that has fish-based sauce. You just can't do it. It's a rule. You can't break the rule. But second, Italians cherish their old ways, especially when it comes to traditional recipes that have been passed on for centuries. And here you have a person, a chef, who went to that context and started asking questions. Why is it that we cook the dish that way? Maybe it made sense 20 years ago, but not today. And it's that type of curiosity that led to a rather successful career and a quite delicious set of meals produced and cooked in his restaurant.
Well, and is that the example from the book? And forgive me for not making sure that this is right, but where he talked about the music and like building, asking all of his employees to, how do you interpret this music? Now let's build a menu.
Doesn't it take a walk on the wild side?
Exactly.
Yeah.
He has all sorts of examples like that where you would find a source of inspiration somewhere from a piece of music, from a piece of art, and then he would just walk into the kitchen and give his staff the title of the piece of music or the name of the portrait or the piece of art. And he wants people to think through how they can come up with a dish based on that inspiration. That's one way to trigger curiosity that I think is quite effective in his context.
It's bringing 2 very divergent components and trying to intermix them. That's very fascinating.
That is fascinating.
And then even in the things that he does, and again, there is an opportunity for all of us, how he reacts to whatever it is that is happening at the restaurant. One of the stories that I love from him is this story of a very busy night at the restaurant where one of the sous chefs was working on a lemon tart. So he was arranging all the pieces in this dessert. And all of a sudden, as he was preparing the dessert, the plate dropped to the floor.
Oh.
And he was starting to panic because here you have a very expensive dessert. And as this sous chef was feeling the way, Chef Massimo Bottura walked into the kitchen and saw the plate on the floor. Now, at many fancy restaurants I visited, the leader would have started yelling, but Bottura didn't. He looked at the plate on the floor and said, Taka was the name of the sous chef. I think we have a new idea for a new dessert. Sure enough, they come up with a deconstructed lemon tart. Is a dessert that is the most popular one at the restaurant. And the name for it is Oops, I Dropped the Lemon Tart.
Oh my gosh.
And again, we all have these opportunities to react to what we see around us. And do we react with curiosity or do we take it as an opportunity to shut curiosity down?
So how much, this is something that plagued me throughout the book, was we've talked a lot about, Kurt and I have talked a lot about Project Aristotle and the work that Google has done on teams and team building and the importance of psychological safety in teams. So what role does trust and psychological safety play in the role of the rebel? Or in the organization that the rebel is living in,
and spurring that curiosity and allowing it to flourish.
Yeah, I think it's very important. I often think about it as respect. It's a couple of the two talents that I discuss as the talents that rebels seems to have, in addition to curiosity, authenticity, and also this desire for novelty. They have perspective, and they think how to best leverage differences between themselves and others. And those two talents, perspective and diversity, are really important because they allow you to suggest ideas, but also react to others' ideas, knowing that you don't necessarily have all the right answers, that there are other ways to approach this problem. And so in a way, when all those ingredients are there, you tend to be more respectful. One very simple way for me to think about how rebels often interact when they are in meetings or in brainstorming session is to think of how strangers come together to work on an improv comedy scene. The rules there, one of their biggest principle that is core to everything that happens in improv comedy is this idea of the yes and. What that means is that if you and I are working on a scene and you suggest an idea, I'm not going to shut it down because I don't think it's as good as mine or what I would have said. Instead, I take it, I accept it, and then I build on it. I might take us to a very different direction, but at least I start from that point of acceptance. And that's perspective. That's having the respect for whatever ideas are being mentioned in the group in a way that allows me to bring my contributions forward. And in the process of doing that and having those type of norms for the group, I think that what we're creating is this sense of psychological safety.
Yeah.
Not easy.
No, are there organizations that, I mean, you work with a lot of big companies around the world. Are there organizations that you think are doing this really well on a large scale? I'm sure that there are some groups that do it well. But on a large scale, are there any organizations that you would hold up as a paragon?
Yeah, so it's interesting that I have a couple of organizations that come to mind. One is, and then we can talk about scaling this, but one is Pixar Animation Studio. So one of the things that Pixar does in their brainstorming meetings, when it's really a time to have that type of psychological safety and people keep exchanging ideas, is to adopt the yes and technique of improv comedy. They call it plussing because it is always to plus on each other's ideas. And what's interesting about what they've created is that not only they've trained people on how to use this technique, but they also pay attention to whether or not you're actually delivering on this idea of doing plussing. So sometimes they have coaches who come and sit in their meetings to really understand whether there are opportunities that we're not really using to be true to the technique of plussing. So It's actually quite impressive to think about the investment that goes into that. It doesn't come naturally to us. We all have this intuitive, quick way of judging others' ideas and this sense of strong belief that our perspective and thoughts are better than those of others. And so it takes some time and thought in removing that judgment. In fact, the president and co-founder of Pixar, Ed Catmull, shared a story that I thought was really fascinating. He was talking about the fact that when they started training people on this technique, there were a few that would understand the concept, but if you're suggesting an idea in a meeting, they used to pause. And the pause is not a good one. He used to call it the death pause.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow.
And the example that he shared with me was, let's imagine that you're taking a walk downtown and you see a friend of yours who just had a baby. And so you're all excited because it's the first time you're going to see your friends after delivering a baby. And so you run over, go next to the stroller, and then you look inside, and then there is silence. The death pause. Because your friend knows that you think that the baby's ugly, and that's why you're not saying anything.
Yeah.
So we often do that in our meetings when we say every idea is a good one, but then we have trouble staying true to that type of message and technique.
Yeah, it's the rolling of the eyes. It's that kind of, it's those subtle hints that people give without actually saying anything. Like, oh, yeah, that's a good idea.
Exactly.
Something I something I have observed in reading lots of your stuff over the years, Francesca, is how open you are about using your own life as examples, your children, the improv classes that you've taken, the cooking classes, the time with your husband. How is it that you come to this kind of openness? And I'm wondering, since openness is kind of a key part of the rebel side, is there a personality trait that lends itself to this?
So in my case, if I think at a very high level, what really gets my attention in the work that I do, it's all about understanding the decision and choices that we make in our life. At work sometimes, but also in our personal life. So I'm really fascinated by the psychology that is behind our decisions. And given that it seems relevant as a question to life much more generally, oftentimes after a paper is done, or in this case, after being on this long project of writing a book, I had a lot of lessons learned for myself as an individual. What it is that I could be doing differently as a parent or as a colleague or as a friend or as a partner. And so I think a lot about that. So a lot of the opportunities I think come from that. It's taking the research seriously, a little bit like you do in this podcast. So if I think about what inspired my gift, an appreciated gift, at least at the beginning, for my husband, in signing us up for improv comedy classes, it was partly reflecting on this wonderful stream of research coming from psychology on the fact that it's nice and important to inject novelty in our relationships because it's easy to fall back onto routines. And so I said, okay, let's take this seriously. And I signed us up for improv comedy classes.
How did he respond to that?
I can still picture his face when he opened up the present. He was so disappointed. He wanted a piece of technology, a gadget. He is a person who's a geek, and so that's what he loves. And even after the first class, the first 2 hours of improv comedy, he actually looked at me and said, I hate this.
Oh.
But fortunately, we had 10 weeks to go. So that changed as we went from class to class.
So there was a death pause when he opened up.
There was a death. Well, actually, there wasn't. It was clearly on his face, a huge disappointment.
Wow.
Oh.
Wow. Well, I was going to ask about some of the things that you've worked on in the past that you feel like need more attention.
Yeah, is there any research that you have done that you go, gosh, I thought this would just really catch fire and somebody would pick it up and really run with it more, but
the findings were amazing.
Yeah, it just hasn't really taken off. Anything that you think should have more attention out there in the world?
So some of it is related to the research in the book. So I have been on the road a lot to talk to many different organizations about the finding behind the books, about the message and the fact that we should really encourage more rebelliousness in organizations and in our life. And usually in the audience, I see a lot of nodding. So people agreeing that that's the right thing to do. What I'm unsure about and sort of I'm hoping is that people are going to keep on talking about the lessons so that they're closer to putting it into action. So if I think about what motivates me to get out of bed in the morning is sort of knowing that somebody's out there really using the research in a way that benefits them, that makes them feel more joy out of the work that they do rather than frustrations. And so I hope that there is going to be even more talking about all the research in the book in a way that really can help people appreciate the work that they do.
What would validate that? What would validate that for you?
That's a good question. I think it's an interesting question to any scholar more broadly of knowing how much of an impact have you made in people. So often you learn because people give you the feedback and they say, I tried this and this worked and these are the challenges I met, but it really made a difference in the way I think about X. And I do receive some of those messages. So, for example, since we were talking about curiosity, one interesting place where I found a really open-minded audience for the research on curiosity is teachers in school.
Oh.
And what's interesting is that many of them, or at least among the ones I talked to, feel the pressure of preparing children to perform to the test. And what they realize, especially in looking at the research, is that they might be missing out on allowing children to retain some of their curiosity. And so it's been quite interesting to have those conversations and see how maybe next time a child asks you a question, rather than just giving an answer, you answer with a question and you help them get to where they need to go to keep the exploration going.
Well, I could see that from the perspective also of you're creating critical thinkers as opposed to people who are responding rote by knowledge and various different things. It's interesting. You talked about at the very beginning that curiosity peaks at that 4 or 5, right before most kids get into more formalized schooling, and how much of that decline in curiosity is a result of just natural aging and how we learn in general, and how much is because you're now put into a school system that isn't necessarily designed to foster that curiosity and to build upon it. I don't know if you've done any research on that or if there's any insights that you could bring to that.
I'm hoping to do some research in collaborations with the schools on this question, since I think it's a really important one, and it might be an easier problem to solve if you start early rather than when we are adults. And so far, no real research, concrete research, but I'm hoping to go in that direction. So I think it's a interesting journey to take on.
Yeah, Sendil Mullainathan, we saw him in New York last fall, and he was talking about this research that he's been doing with kids in risky neighborhoods, where they tested, well, what if we just take the kids out of the risky neighborhoods? Can we move them into a safer neighborhood, and they'll just be better? And he found that after they're 6-7 years old, they're too old. That the old habits are already ingrained, and so they have to move the kids out of those environments when they're really, really young in order to have a long-lasting effect on them.
And to me, the key is how, again, looking at myself as a parent or as a colleague in the work that I do we say yes to all the micro opportunities that come our way? So we talked about how you can answer a question with another question, or rather than being so focused on just executing on your to-do list, are you allowing for a little bit more time for exploration? And often it's really in the small behaviors. Are we the first to model curiosity to others? And so there is where I see some opportunities for all of us to make a difference.
So how much is enough time to support for curiosity?
So I would think of it as an investment in the sense that for 2 reasons. First of all, is that often it's something that might create a little bit less efficiency in time to start with, but that has great benefits later on that save you time. And we're not good at thinking through that trade-off. But I also think about another important aspect of this. I visited a lot of organizations that really embrace rebelliousness and is working out really well for them, with people being quite constructive and productive and innovative. And for the very fact that they're encouraged to stay curious, they know when it's time to put their heads down and execute on the work versus keep on expanding and asking questions. And so people form a very good judgment if you trust them a bit. And what is interesting is that organizations that also embrace rebelliousness have 100% clarity, 100% transparency on the type of rules that should not be broken. And so there is where people are not applying curiosity because they know that they should not apply curiosity there.
So you have some parameters within which the curiosity can operate,
like the accounting team and the legal team,
or on even simpler things like one of the organizations I can think of that really embraces curiosity and other talent is Ariel Investment, a money management firm based in Chicago. And what is interesting is that you can go to every single employee and they would tell you rules that are not supposed to be touched. So, for example, when a letter goes out to a client, 2 or 3 people need to look at it to make sure that it's clear, no typos, etc. That is a rule that nobody would ever think of questioning because the leadership made that very clear and transparent to them.
Okay. Yeah. So you're setting the boundaries within which you can operate, which sometimes, and I'm not an expert in this area, but my understanding is that, sometimes constraints can actually create some of those new ways of thinking because you don't have a fully, wide open range but within these constraints, now you have to come up with some unique and novel ways of solving it. And so I'm wondering if even some of those constraints help in, the responses that people create from that.
Yeah, if we pay attention to the research would say absolutely that when you have few more constraints rather than just complete freedom, you end up being more innovative and creative.
Yeah.
Again, you're thinking more thoughtfully about the resources that are available to you.
Yeah. You bring up in the book counterfactual thinking as a key way of kind of getting around this. First off, if you could just really quickly tell our listeners what counterfactual thinking is for some of them that may not know. And then how does that use? How would you use that in an organization or even in your personal life?
Yeah, counterfactual thinking is all about asking ourselves, how is it that a certain decision or a certain situation could be different? So if you didn't take a certain action, or if you did take an action, how is it that things could have gone in a different direction? And what's interesting is that as humans, we often approach life just focusing on just one way of looking at the situation or looking at the problem. Usually it's our own perspective. Yeah. That's the focus that we have. And we don't ask ourselves, well, how is it that this could have been different? Or if a person comes to us with a certain statement because they want to convince us of an idea that they have, we don't stop and ask, how is it that they could have framed the argument differently so that we would also have responded differently? So counterfactual thinking is all about asking ourselves to go down that path of reimagining what happened so that we realize that maybe things could have been a bit different.
And it's hard, right?
It's very hard.
Yeah.
It's very hard. It's a little bit, to me, in a sense, it's similar to accumulating experience and staying open-minded to the fact that there is still a lot to learn and we might be wrong.
Right. Well, Annie, we spoke with Annie Duke, who wrote Thinking in Bets, and one of the terms that she uses is resulting, which is this almost hindsight bias, right? And the fact that we have a really hard time in looking at what went into our decision when we know the result, and being, if the result is good, we think the decision process was good. If result was bad, we think the decision process was bad. And her whole component is saying, that's not always true. There's a component of luck and other factors that come in. And so we have to separate out the result from the decision process that goes into that result. And it sounds, counterfactual thinking is that component of saying, look, we got this result, but what are the other results if we would have just done things a little bit differently? And I think those are really interesting components of, again, challenging how we normally think and how we tend to go through life with maybe blinders on or very myopic in our viewpoint.
It's easier.
Well, and Tim, I know you like easier.
I like it. I like easy.
Yeah.
My system one is, man, it's on all the time.
I agree that it's easier. And in fact, oftentimes going for really the idea of embracing the talents that I talk about in Rebel Talent, we're increasing discomfort and we're making it harder on people. When I think about perspective, about this idea of really surrounding myself with people who think differently, who are going to challenge my opinion, who likes that? The people are nodding their heads and agreeing with me, but that's not good for the decisions that I'm going to make in the end. And so I was very much drawn by people, leaders, employees who were really able to approach situation from different perspective, and they seem to be okay being challenged by others.
Yeah. Well, that's when you brought up the idea of 100% of a company being rebels, being the one that you chose. And in my head, I'm going, oh, that sounds painful. It sounds like everything gets questioned. But to a point, right? If you can learn to live with that and you're able to function that way, what great outcomes that could reach.
Yeah. And again, it requires some honesty with ourselves. When I teach about perspective, I often ask my students to sit down and do a very quick exercise where they're asked to think about people in their network that they go to at work when they need a second opinion, or maybe they're making a decisions and they want just to talk it through with another person. And so they list their people. Some have 5, 8, 10, some they have just fewer than that. And when they have listed their names, I ask them to go back to the list and give each person a score. And the score represents how similar the person is to you in their way of thinking. So 5 is very similar, 1 is very dissimilar, anything in between. And it's remarkable to see how many people, including me, when I went through this exercise and I studied these things, have a lot of 4 and 5. So you're surrounded by people who are going to basically just nod their heads and agree with you. And so there is a very simple solution. Unpop the unpleasantness and add people who are going to challenge your way of thinking.
Yeah, but they might say I'm wrong.
There is an interesting CEO of a company based in New York called Catch a Fire. And it's a startup that have been growing quite fast. And every time she hires people, she gives them the type of problems that the organization is struggling through. And when the candidates give their answers, she pays really close attention. And she's trying to look for people who fundamentally disagree with her. They look at the situation from a very different standpoint, and then she brings those in. It's hard, but it's good for the business.
Well, that's hiring for diversity in a really large way. That's a huge commitment.
So, Francesca, is there any research that you're working on right now, new research that you think is really fascinating that you might want to be able to share with our listeners as you're going through? Any fun research that you're currently working on?
Yeah, so some of the research that I'm doing that is building upon some of the themes and struggle that came from working on the book is a research on receptiveness. So how is it that we can find ourselves disagreeing with one another and really stay open-minded and being able to approach with curiosity the views and arguments that others are bringing to the table? So one of the things that we're testing is whether we can make people more receptive to others' views when they know that they're going to be in a conflict or in a disagreement by asking them to change their assumptions about the people they're interacting with. So often when we're in a conflict or in a bad collaboration or in a situations where we feel stuck because we can't quite work together, we start thinking that the other side or the other people involved are stupid, don't have the right set of competencies, or they're not quite prepared, or maybe they don't care as much about the project or the situation as we do. And so what we're trying to do in some of our studies is to change the assumptions to the person or the people involved are smart and they're caring. And with that, the hypothesis is that you're going to approach the conversation, the disagreement, asking yourself a very different question where you're going to say, well, if they're smart and caring, how is it that they're going to have such a different view from mine? And so we're interested in seeing how that leads to better debates and better decision-making if you're actually working together with those people.
Wow. I could see that in organizations where you have two, very strong leaders that are coming into a situation maybe with differing ideas. And you tend to disregard their their thoughts or inputs because you place those labels on them, whatever they would be, and just changing those assumptions at the head start could really impact how that happens. So
yeah. Who are you working on that with?
It's a team effort. One of the colleagues I'm working with is Julia Minson, who's a colleague at the Kennedy School, and then a postdoc here at HBS called Mike Humans, who's doing a lot of really interesting work using algorithm to try to capture the patterns in our language. And then we have a research assistant who hopefully is going to be a doctoral student next year.
Wow.
Nice. Wow.
Yeah, it's quite a team.
I would be fascinated by the algorithms to capture, the language components. That sounds fascinating in and of itself. So
yeah, I had a conversation with somebody recently that said that they're doing, they're checking MRIs and VMRIs of people when they introduce a new product to them visually or with a narrative. And they find that when there's a narrative, a story around what the new product is, their brains light up in all kinds of ways that are much more fully embracing of the new product than just when they're shown a picture of what the new product is.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So story and narrative and language are really critical to, how we construct these things. So.
Yeah, it's an exciting path for the future, since it seems like some of the technology and techniques that we can use in research can allow us to answer a question that we wouldn't be able to answer before. Mike Humans is also the person who, in a different project, allowed us to build, he calls it a politeness algorithm. So during conversation, he was able to say when it is that we are more or less polite. And we were trying to understand whether politeness is reciprocated. And not only that, so for example, if we are in a business discussion like a negotiation, whether it's politeness tracks with the concessions that we're making to negotiate.
Wow.
Yeah, we found that you can keep the two separate. So I can be very polite, but still have a lot of money in my pocket.
Wow. Okay, so we'd like to talk just a little bit about music in our podcast.
You would like to talk a little bit about
I
music.
would like.
Okay.
Kurt reminds all of us that it really is about me at this point. So.
I enjoy it, just not to the same level.
Do you play an instrument?
Well, I do, but hey,
questions. Ask as many questions. Yes, he plays. He's a singer-songwriter. He gets up and performs.
I do.
Wow.
So, I do, but I think that music has huge impacts on our lives, and right now you're impacted a lot by Pokemon and Baby Shark and things like that. But that's just right now, right? That's just in the world.
And can I clarify to those who are gonna listen in that those songs are due to the fact that I have 3 small children? That's the primary source of where those songs come from.
It could just be the time of life that you have, and you might just like those. I don't know.
I don't know. I have to admit, I sang Baby Beluga long after my kids were out of the Raffi stage. So it's like an earworm. But no. So what? So maybe growing up, what are we go back to those roots when music has that neurological imprinting on our brains when we're young teenagers. What were you listening to, and what do you like to listen to now? If you could turn on a station right now, what would be that station?
So I like the type of music that gets you dancing. So I often, if my children are not in the car, that's what I'm likely listening to. It's the beat. It sort of gives me energy and gets me ready for the day. That's probably not the music that I was listening to when I was growing up. I think that the images that I have in my head was for a summer I was working. This was quite a job. I was working as one of those people who's picking up potatoes in a farm.
In the field, you were pulling potatoes out of the ground?
Yeah, you're on your knees, and the entire day is spent just picking up potatoes from the ground. But you have a partner working with you on the other side of the basket. And he decided on day 2, after doing 8 hours of just picking potatoes, and I guess talking to me, that wasn't fun. And so he brought a radio with him, and we would listen to classical music.
Classical music.
Yeah. Which I thought was bizarre, given that we were picking up potatoes, but that was his choice. And I guess given that I had bored him for 8 hours in a row the day prior, I went for it.
Do you have any fond memories of any of that classical music?
I'm not sure, because what I'm really remembering is the picking up potatoes. I think he made the day go faster, actually.
Yeah.
Which is and also made me wonder more, since I wasn't talking directly to him, since we were listening to music. I wonder more with my head.
So now is classical music always paired with this thought of picking potatoes, though, for you? I mean, you
most
might
of
be
the
totally
time,
off.
that's what crosses my head, and at least I'm smiling with the memory.
Well, what music with good beats? I mean, we could go back to swing music from the 1930s and 40s. We could be in disco music from the 70s. We could be in hip hop,
Latin dance music.
Latin dance music. I don't know what are the kinds of musical themes that you like to listen to with the right beat?
So when I'm home and I'm on my own, and I would talk to Alexa, I'll ask Alexa or Google to pick the best disco dance club songs of 2018. And at times I go back in time just to, again, remind myself of what I was doing many years ago. So sometimes it's from the 90s.
Very fun.
It's actually quite interesting because it is... It reminds me, puts images in my head of the different things that I was doing years ago.
We have had more guests when we get to this musical conversation who are, with the advent of Google or Alexa, Spotify, Pandora, and the ability to be able to just call up music at will that might be, disco dance music of 2018 or, French cooking music, when you're doing so, and the ability. I wonder how much that has shaped our listening components. It has to have had an impact, because back in the day when I was growing up, right, you could put the radio on and whatever the radio was playing, or you had an album or cassette deck or CD, but you had to go out and purchase that. You had to have that or make your mixtape, and now it's as easy as calling something up and you listen to it, and there's not an investment in it because you can switch. You don't like it, there.
Yeah, next song, Alexa. You're making a very different investment if you're the one chooses and picking.
Yeah.
Maybe the more important question is, when are you ever at home alone?
That is indeed a very good question.
Oh my gosh. With that, we are so grateful for your time, Francesca, and this conversation was really, really fun. So thank you.
Same here. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much.
So really, we're just going to cut off the recording right here, but
can you
really
sing
are.
for me, given that you're such a good singer into music? And what would you pick?
What would I pick for what? For
just singing to me for 1 minute.
You want? Oh my God!
Pick one of your songs. Here we go. Let's go. We have this. He has 6 albums, so
Wow.
There you go.
Wow. Okay. My God, I cannot believe that I'm.
I like this. You're putting him on the spot. I love it.
All right.
Didn't you read the chapter about novelty and discomfort? And here we go.
No, I skipped over that totally. Okay, so I'm going to sing a song that I wrote when I finished graduate school in 1991. I'll sing you the first verse. How about that?
Okay.
And the chorus. And it's called The Ballad of Lucinda. And it's based on a poem by Edgar Lee Masters. And it's a reflection of what this girl's life was like. And she's making the reflection after she has died. So her perspective is, now that she's died, she's looking back on her life. And it's about Lucinda Matlock. So I played snap out in Winchester at the evening dance. You put me on the floor and I would prance. I was the princess, the belle of the ball, for one short night in a town so small. The boys did not know that I could not swim, jumping foolish on the bridge rail's rim. And a bump was all I needed, and I headed for the drink. Who would have thought that I would sink? Oh, wondrous world, what are you thinking of? Well, you ended my life when I was so young. Oh, you took me to the water and the rotting ground. I could see me going down. Spoon River, you just let me drown.
Ooh,
Woohoo!
very good. Was that from the Spoon River Anthology?
This came from the Spoon River Anthology.
That's
That was
one,
the
of my favorite books. There you go. I never heard that one. There you go.
Great talent.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Francesca, thank you very much. We appreciate your time and wonderful stuff. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you
Bye-bye.
later.
Rest of the day. Bye.
you
too.
too. Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our Behavior Grooves interview, have a free-flowing discussion on some of those topics, and whatever else comes into our curiously rebel brains.
Curiously rebel. That's a pretty swift combo there. Nicely done.
That was
Yeah,
good. You know,
yeah.
I took curious and I combined it with rebel.
How-
And that was creative.
How do you how do you mind bend those two incredibly different things together? You're really just amazing.
You know,
You're El Fuego today.
El Fuego. Ooh. So, what were your initial response to our conversation? Where do you want to run with this?
So there's three things I'd love to cover in our discussion today.
Uno, dos, tres.
Curiosity.
Okay.
Yes, and number two, and then clarity and creativities and boundaries and all that kind of other stuff in number three.
Wait. You just threw out all that other stuff in number three.
Well, just because I just needed a catch-all because there's so much to talk about. There's so much to talk about.
Let's begin. Let's dig in on curiosity.
Yeah. Okay. So first, a little bit of historic perspective on this. That curiosity has been studied since like the late 1800s.
It's been studied for a lot longer than that. I mean, if you think about...
Okay, academic papers published on it.
Okay.
All right. And it goes like Darwin spoke about curiosity in the early 1900s. Curiosity was linked as an emotion associated with children.
Well, that wasn't Darwin, was it?
No, this was after Darwin.
Okay.
Yeah. And then in the 1960s, it got caught up with sexuality.
Okay.
You know, kind of reflective of the times, right? Where curiosity and arousal kind of went together. And then you move into the 1980s, and then it gets tied with academic performance, curiosity and academic performance.
And so, well, and I think one of the interesting things that Francesca brought up was this component of we're born curious. That you talk about. She talked about her kids. I know with my kids, you just talk to any. I coach skiing, downhill skiing on the weekends, and those kids, they're in second and third grade, and they are just 10,000 questions at you, and not about skiing, about everything else, right?
Right.
And so we have this curiosity that is an innate component within us. And then, as she said, it kind of gets, we grow out of it, or it gets beat out of us, or the system and the schooling and everything else kind of take it away. What do you think about that?
Well, isn't part of it just us as parents that are taking it away? That there's this sense of frustration of, why can't I go out? My older brother isn't wearing a top to a swimsuit. A young girl says, why can't I do that?
Yeah.
And I can only imagine that at least part of the time there's some frustration in the parent's voice that says, no, you just can't.
That death silence, or the death pause.
The death pause.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And children pick up on that, right?
Sure.
Or they pick up on those subtle cues, or they pick up on, just cause.
That's right.
And you end up, responding to that curiosity in a way that doesn't enhance it, but actually can smash it or decrease it to a degree.
Yeah, I had a friend who said that his dad would have sort of the same smart-ass comment to, Dad, how did a traffic light get invented? Oh, well, Bob Traffic Light created that. And so he used to say that, and after a while it got funny, but it was just dodging the question.
Yeah.
And so the child learns, well, what's the point of asking the question if Bob, pot sticker created pot stickers, and Bob Sharp Knife created sharp knives? I mean, it's just silly.
I want to meet Bob.
Yeah.
I want to ask Bob all these questions.
That's who we need on the show.
Let's find Bob. Let's get Bob on the show. If Bob's out there, let us know. Contact us.
So where do you see curiosity manifesting itself in your life?
Well, I am innately curious, I think, on a number of things. I think that's why we have this show, right?
Right, exactly.
We have this show because we're both curious about why we do what we do. And so I think that's always a contributing kind of curiosity component. Sometimes I think in work, we tend to, talk about curiosity as this good thing, but then we don't always appreciate it when it's in reality. And I was a little surprised when Francesca, at the very beginning, when we asked 0%, 50%, or 100% rebels in the company, and she went with 100% rebels.
100%, yes.
Because to me, that would be would be a painful organization to live in.
Chaos, maybe?
I think, where every decision gets to, be challenged all the time, and are you undermining those things? But to that degree, how much do we just take things for granted?
Well, she did come back and say rules are important.
She did.
Right. And it's okay to say this is the way that we do things.
And you have to work within these parameters. You can be as creative and as crazy as you want, but there are these kind of, road, that we have to stay on. This
is part of what makes sporting games fun, right? Is that it wouldn't be fun to watch a basketball game without any rules. Just to have it be a complete free for all. Are you thinking?
Well,
maybe
I'm just
it would
thinking
be
in my head that could be kind of cool. But no, you're right. I think there is very much this element of, and I think to another degree, and we talked a little bit about this, that those rules sometimes enhance our creativity.
Right.
Because we have to figure out how to do something differently within the confines of these parameters.
Yeah.
And so it's not easy. You can't just spend $100 million on something. We only have $100,000. How are we going to launch this product with $100,000? How can we do it creatively? Because we can't just inundate every media market out there.
Those are great constraints to have. It's like when it comes to songwriting, if someone just says, "Okay, write a song."
All right.
About what? For what reason? But to say, okay, now write a song about the first time you knew you were falling in love with your partner.
Right.
Oh, now that's something I can focus on, and that's a great parameter to have and a boundary to put on the be creative. And now a nearly infinite amount of creativity can flow from that. But without that direction, it's without any kind of boundaries, then it can be just kind of a waste of time.
Yeah. And I liked her conversation about the chef and coming in and using the music as inspiration for creating meals.
Hey, babe, take a walk on the wild side.
Think about the components that go into that, right? You are taking a song that has some emotional component, as we've talked about many times, that songs have that emotional connection with us. And now you're saying, use that as an inspiration for something that is totally disparate from what that song is. Take a walk on the wild side and food. Come on, and being able to push the limits on that. So again, I think one of the things that I'm taking away from this is how can you be more creative? And maybe some of the ways that you can be more creative are taking two juxtapositions of things that are kind of very disparate.
Okay, not necessarily opposite, but
No.
different.
Curious and rebel, right?
Oh, yeah.
And then you bring them together. Again, like and I can't remember the chef's name.
Chef Botura.
Batura, bringing in music as an inspiration to creating a meal.
He was also a master at the yes and, when the lemon tart falls on the floor, and instead of firing the sous chef for letting it fall, saying, looks like we've just created something new.
Yes, and now we have lemon meringue, mix up or whatever it was.
So yes and got applied in a big way when I was in my corporate life.
Okay.
Because my team went through a training on brainstorming, and yes and was central to it because it was delivered by John Sweeney and the Brave New Workshop and their improvisational style.
Who we interviewed a month ago.
And so yes and was core to how you brainstorm and how you even conduct meetings, how you interact with each other. And we embraced it. So my team embraced it. And we would be in meetings and someone would say something, and my geeky brain.
Oh, you're using that term.
All right. But I would be judgmental and think, what the hell is he talking about? Like, that is a crazy. And before I could even be completely judgmental, someone else in the room would say yes, and then go on to the next thing or expand on it, and only to remind me that, wow, we can still use that as a platform. Even what I considered a bad idea was a platform to come up with a cooler idea or something else. And but it took discipline. And eventually that discipline became habit.
And I think the interesting piece about this, because yes and has come up a couple different times now, and it's also come up from this component. It was brought up today in the conversation with Francesca, in the conversation about psychological safety. And
yes.
We talked about Project Aristotle, and we've talked about that a number of times on previous episodes, but it keeps coming up. And yes and is a way of helping deliver psychological safety for people, because now that, as you said, that response that you might have had in the past to a suggestion, which would have been more of a shutdown response,
the death pause,
or just not even a death pause.
What the hell's wrong with you?
That's an idiotic idea,
Yes.
Which is like what I want to say to you half the time when we talk.
And you don't. You maintain some kind of balance most of the time.
Most of the time. But I think in those situations, by using a yes and component, you're creating this safe space, because now, instead of being shut down, the idea may not be adopted, but it's used as fodder, as you said, to then go to that next level and build upon that. So I think, in Pixar, in what she was talking about, using the component where, that was the plussing, right?
The plussing,
it's
right.
It's just another name
cool.
for yes and, but adding on to things as opposed to, either ignoring or denigrating whatever that comment is. You build upon it. And I think that lends itself into psychological safety, which helps in enhancing curiosity, which helps in creating a organization that can be rebel in how it approaches issues, the market, whatever it is that you want to think about.
With the team that I worked with in corporate life, we had a rule that there was no bad idea. Every idea that got spouted out would be, if we were recording it on a whiteboard or jotting on some kind of piece of paper, that we would record it. Mm-hmm. And inevitably, there was always somebody that would say something completely remote, like monkeys with machine guns. And regardless, actually, monkeys with machine guns came up in many, many brainstorms for the most ridiculous thing. But when someone couldn't think of something to say, they would just say, monkeys with machine guns. And you go, what is that? And the funny thing about this is that it twists your brain a little bit, and good ideas always flowed from that.
Right.
It was never a shut down kind of experience. It was always a catalyst for more ideas.
I used a different kind of thing in some of the workshops I've done, where you come up with an idea and then you list out 10 words that are the opposite, that are completely opposite of that word.
Okay.
And now you take a couple of you from there, you pick one or two of those words, and then you go back and you then do the opposite of those words, but you can't use the original word. So you're getting these confluent kind of ideas coming in, and you use it in a brainstorming idea or a strategy session, and you're trying to really wrap yourself around what does this really mean. And when you do that, it's this component that helps in again, people coming in and helping to think through ideas and looking at it from different perspectives. And it's a really fascinating way of doing that.
Would it be fair to say that there's some counterfactual thinking that went on in that?
Yeah, I think there's some counterfactual components and various different aspects. I mean, we were looking at it from words, so it wasn't necessarily outcomes and then what could potentially be. But there is that component of looking at, all right, so we want to grow. All right, well, let's take growth. All right. Now,
as the word.
As the word. Now let's come up with 10 words that mean different than growth, and then you pick one or two of those words, and then you go back, and then all of a sudden growth becomes something else. So the word that becomes, it's not growth anymore. It's I can't think of it off the top.
Enhancement.
Enhancement, or acceleration, or something along that line. And so now you have a different perspective on that, and you're not just going through the motions of some of that strategy.
Part of what makes that really appealing to me is that the team or the people who are working together in this discussion have the authority and the responsibility to go after the task of opposites.
Yeah.
Rather than sitting in a conference room saying, with a leader where it's unspoken, but everybody knows no one's going to say anything counter to what the leader has to say.
Yeah, and I think you could take that component and bring it up to, everybody talks about having a devil's advocate or various different things in some of these components. And, maybe it isn't having a devil's advocate. Maybe it's everybody being kind of thinking through what are some of the alternatives, or what are some, those wild, hairy kind of crazy ideas that you could bring into this. So
sounds like you're recommending 100% rebels.
100% rebels. Maybe I am. I thought it was interesting when she was talking about the study that she had done about new employees and how curious they were when they started. And then
right at the beginning.
6 months later, they go back in, and there was a 20% decline. And it got me thinking, because we interviewed Jeff Gallick from Carnegie Mellon, and he talks about this component of hedonic decline,
right?
Which is the idea that when we get accustomed to something, our satisfaction, our enjoyment of that declines. The hedonic element that we get from it declines. And you think about the favorite song that you listen to, and when you listen to it over and over and over again, all of a sudden it gets to be old and secondhand, and it's not as enjoyable.
The first candy bar tastes good. The second one is like, the third one's like, I can't do any more of this candy bar.
Well, it depends on what kind of candy bar. Come on. Well, I mean, if it's a Kit Kat,
then you could have 100.
A Baby Ruth, maybe. I don't know.
Well, and Jeff sort of likened this to the marginal utility
Right.
theory in economics.
But it struck me as we were talking with Francesca that is there a component about that around curiosity as well?
Right.
Is there a decline in curiosity that just comes naturally because it's a new situation, you're at a new job, you're curious about a number of different things, and maybe you've now grown accustomed, and so are you still as curious about that job? So is it a natural decline?
I thought it was fabulous that they were using these objective measures as well. It wasn't just a survey. It wasn't self-reporting. I love behavioral stuff where they're actually going and
Looking
what
at the number of
people do.
emails and looking at who they sent emails to and
What
how frequently and
departments.
how far away from their normal social network. It was really great. And I loved, I love this part, right? Where she's
Are you
talking
going to
about,
say the P word?
I am going to say the P word, where she talked about priming of curiosity and how simple texts and emails just priming people to think about questions or, to use those questions was a way to increase the likelihood of curious behavior. That was fascinating. I mean, what can't you prime?
Okay, that is going to take another separate grooving session because what can't you prime is a big damn question.
Well, and I'm wondering if there is anything that you can't prime to a certain degree.
Well, I don't know right off the top of my head.
I'm curious about that. I think it's something we need to explore.
All right. Okay,
So-
that's fair. Let me ask you this. Is there anything that comes to your mind that you think, no, that couldn't be primed?
Off the top of my head, no. I
No,
have to
right.
think about these
So-
things, but
Priming is powerful stuff.
yeah, and just so again from that component, so if we want to be more curious, right, or if we want to be more rebel, in other words, challenging the status quo, what are the primes that we can use, right? Can
Yes.
we send automatic messages to us? Can we put something in where? Or maybe it's just on our calendar where every Tuesday morning it's our curiosity, half hour.
Yes.
I don't know. There are some things like that you could do. Or from a rebel perspective, how can you prime to challenge the status quo? We should have some rebel socks. I think we should make some
do
rebel
that.
socks.
I had a boss who had a policy that once a quarter, he and I would do something that had nothing to do with work. It wouldn't just be social time. One time we went to a anthropological discussion with Maeve Leakey.
Okay.
Another time we went bowling.
Okay.
So it was just completely changing up the context of what we were doing during the middle of the workday so that we could come back and feel refreshed and look at the world a little differently.
So with my employee, we have a developmental component as part of his MBOs. And so it's about going to conferences or taking some training or various different things. And I pushed him to think. So the first time we had this in place, he went and he did a Nancy Duarte, presentation show conference, right? And learning how to make better presentations and various different things, which is very good.
Yeah.
But the second time, he came up with some really interesting ideas that weren't necessarily work-related. And what we finalized on was for him to go get his scuba certificate. So he learned how to, he went to a 2 or 3 day scuba lesson where he, put the tanks on and learned and got his PADI certification. And the one caveat that I had is that you have to come back and you have to write a paper on this and talk about what you learned and how, if any, behavioral science principles were being used. And so it's this idea of taking a component that is not traditionally thinking about this element of behavioral science and applying that. And this recent one that he did, and we might even be talking about this at a future podcast, but he did a component where he went out and he did avalanche training.
Yes.
And again, thinking about how do you apply behavioral science into what's going on when you're being taught about how to live through and understand what, avalanche dangers if you're skiing. So
And how to manage that.
and how to manage that.
Yeah, well, Ben did a great write-up on the PADI certification story in a blog, and so I'll make sure that we link to that in the show notes, because he did a great job of
Yeah, it was
discussing that.
fantastic. So.
Yeah, it's just terrific.
All right, anything else on curiosity?
No, what keeps you curious about music? What keeps you listening to new music? Because I know you listen to new music as well.
I do listen to new music. I am a, I like my old standbys to a certain degree. It takes you back. We've had that conversation. I think new music is one of those components where there's that novelty of it, right? There is this element of where can this take me? And to a degree, if you looked at my big five personality, I'm sure I score really high on openness.
Openness, yeah.
And so that openness to experience is a motivator component for me. And I like hearing new things. I like having that ability to, not just have that same four chords from before 1978. Play over and over.
That is so unfair. I played a show last night, and just out of the 14 songs that we did, there were 2 that were newer than 1980. So just
2?
Yeah.
2.
It was a Neil Young tribute show. Okay,
There enough said. What about you? What keeps you curious about music?
Yeah, I don't know what the intellectual or the sort of the cognitive drive is, but it's there. It's just available to me to say, well, what are new artists doing? Not even who's being heralded, but I like to kind of look up lists of people from Nashville is always doing a great job of promoting their recent up and comers.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, what are they writing? What do they sound like? And what kind of sounds are they making in the studio? And what are the stories that they're telling, and how are they telling them? I don't fully understand why, other than variety seeking or novelty seeking.
Are you curious about different sounds as much as like different components?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. What's the sound of? So there's Saint Vincent. Is a young female songwriter, singer-songwriter.
Okay.
Worked with David Byrne and a whole variety of bands, but she said that she has an old a vintage Gibson acoustic guitar with really dead strings on it. And she said there's just no ring to it. And she said, I love that sound. And so there's this part of me that's like, why? Why is there that curiosity about that particular sound? Because that is the antithesis of the kind of sound that I tend to like out of an acoustic guitar. But then I listen to her songs, and it's like, that fits perfectly with the way she writes and she sings.
Yeah.
It's in perfect harmony with the way she sings and creates music.
Well, I'll go back to, one of my favorite bands, which is Depeche Mode. And for the first part of their existence, they didn't use guitars, and they used samples. They used a ton of different samples.
Right.
And the sound, they went, I listened to a interview with them, and they were just like taking, little samples of just everything, hitting a metal pipe that's out in the playground to,
flushing the toilet.
I don't know if they did that, but they probably might have. But they did all these different components, and they then intermixed that into their musical sound. And it was an amazing component. Now it's kind of been overdone, I think, a lot, but that still is one of those components of, well, awesome.
So with that,
everybody, thank you for listening, and
keep on grooving.